Christians are given a mission, and that is to make disciples of Jesus. That is the ultimate goal for all churches and disciples. But then we know that it's almost impossible for us to even make disciples in our own church. Okay, if you're a branch leader, you would know what it means. You try to disciple them through katok, they ignore you. You try to call them, they ignore you. Making disciples is most difficult work, but it's the most important work for all Christians. Now, in previous generations, what a lot of preachers and churches preached about making disciples was how Christians need to be influential in the world. And so all Christians were encouraged to be professional and good at what they do, and be diligent in their workplaces and be skillful so that they earn trust and they earn respect from people in the world so that they can actually preach the gospel to the people in the world through our skills, right? And often people would mention about Joseph, who was put in a position of prime minister of Egypt. And because of Joseph, the whole Egypt was saved from famine. Now, I agree with this. I agree with the fact that Christians should be influential and be successful in a way. But the thing is this. But one thing that we need to know about being successful and being influential in the world is that who we're competing with is the people in the world. Now, Christians and the worldly people have different ethics and morals. Yes, the world is starting to emphasize characters and diligency at workplaces, but more people are not really caring about those stuff, but they're more into success. And that means we're going to have to compete with people who won't really run the race in the rule, but outside the rule of the game, when we have to keep all the rules in the game. And that's almost impossible to win. Now, I'm not talking about being influential or successful within the Christian circle. I was looking at this video from Bethel, and they were like saying how they divide famous people and Christian famous. You know how there are Christian famous people who are only famous within the Christian circles, but they're like actual famous people. Now, the thing about this, about being influential is this. If the influence that the church needs to talk about isn't really about in the church, but outside the church. And that's where the competition is at, and that's where the difficulty comes. Because, even if the world is emphasizing characters and diligency, if you look at all the influential people, they're not as good in character or diligent in the workplaces. In the end, the world listens to successful people. So once you become successful, that's when people will listen to you. And now, we have these 3 things that you need to have to be called a successful person in the world. And there are 3 P's. Okay? Power, social positions, and possessions. You have to be rich in possession. You have to be in high social positions. And you have to be powerful in the world. Now, here is a dilemma. If you want power, position, and possession, and so to be a successful person, you might not be able to keep that relationship with Jesus. Okay. Hard work and good characters are important. but they don't guarantee success in this world. Now, what about the Christians who actually made it, okay? Who's actually successful in the world? I have to tell you that it is God who put them in that place. So, yes, there was hard work, there was diligence, but it wasn't everything that made them successful in the world. It was by grace that they became the successful people in the world. Now, what I'm saying is this. What I'm saying is, if success and influence are the same words, and if you have to be successful to be influential, then you're going to be in dilemma. And the dilemma is this. We wanted to be in good relationship with Jesus, but then we will have to betray that relationship so that we go after the worldly things. Now, if you want to chase after the relationship with Jesus, then you will have to give up that influence you need to have in the world. And that would be betrayal to the mission of God. Now, what do we do then? How do we resolve this? We must look at how the Christians in the Bible were influential. What kind of way they influenced people in the world. And especially if you look at Jesus and his disciples, especially Jesus, you wouldn't say Jesus was a successful man, right? But was he influential? Yes, he was. Jesus was just a carpenter. Jesus was just a normal man who was not really average, but rather a poor man. He was influential. The world we live in in the ages of AD, and the whole history is divided into BC and AD. So Jesus was influential when he was not necessarily successful. And that shows us that to be influential, you don't necessarily have to be successful in the world. But there is something else that you need to have. What makes you influential then? What makes somebody to be influential Christians so that the world is actually affected by us? And that's why we're looking at the book of Luke, especially the first 4 verses today. Now, why don't we just read verse 2, okay, together. Let's read verse 2 together. Ready, set, go. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. Okay. Now, what these verses are saying is this. In the early churches, the Christians didn't learn about Jesus off the book. So it wasn't Bible first and then they learned. It was people, the eyewitnesses who are the apostles of Jesus, the disciples, they taught Jesus. They taught people about Jesus. And then when did the book come in? They started writing it when they felt like they really needed to write it. And that means they didn't really see the need of writing down things about Jesus because they didn't really expect Jesus to come back this late. Okay, they expected him to return really soon. And so they were thinking to just not write anything but keep teaching until Jesus come back. But then Jesus was taking time. One by one, church leaders were dying off. So they, in the end, felt the need to make a hard copy of Jesus' account. Now, Luke was one of them. And we need to have a look at who Luke is and why Luke wrote his Bible, his gospel. Now, the reason Luke decided to write about Jesus was a little different. Matthew, he wrote about Jesus for the Jewish Christians. John, he wrote about Jesus for the churches that he was leading. Mark, he was writing about Jesus for the Gentile Christians. What about Luke? Luke was writing this for one specific person, according to verse 3 and 4. Why don't we just read verse 3 together. Ready, set, go. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Now, the name Theophilus is in Greek the loved one, loved by God. The scholars say that this is not a real name, but this is like a secret name because church was under persecution and the Christians were under persecution. So if you have a real name, it was kind of dangerous. So they assume that Luke was writing to a person, the real person, but then he didn't really write the real name. Now, let's just say he's Theophilus, okay? Now, who was Theophilus? Luke says, most excellent Theophilus. Now, why, okay, we're going to look at what the relationship between Luke and Theophilus is a little bit later. But then I think we need to look at verse 4 that tells us why Luke wrote it for him. And that tells us how Theophilus didn't have certainty concerning Jesus. And here's the thing. Many people in the church, we learn about the Bible. We listen to sermons. We read the Bible. But a lot of people don't have certainty. And that certainty in Jesus, that faith, often becomes uncertain. And then what do we do? What do you do when you see your friend in the church swaying away from God? Do you just tell them to believe? Now, you can't do that because you can't force people to believe. Romans chapter 10, verse 17 says, faith comes from hearing. Now, faith comes from hearing, and hearing from the word of Jesus, the word of Christ. Now, what has to happen when somebody is being uncertain about Jesus is that someone next to him has to speak the word of God to them. Someone has to help them out so that they can be certain. And Luke was helping Theophilus. Now, what's really interesting is a title that Luke uses to describe Theophilus, which is most excellent. And this shows us what kind of relationship Luke and this person was. And it tells us who Luke was. Now, who is Luke? As you might know, Luke was a physician, a doctor, and you're like, okay, are we not talking about unsuccessful people? And now Luke's a doctor. Okay, let me give you another title of Luke. Luke was a client of a patron. Now, what's a client? What's a patron? It's like a ancient system, relationship system in Rome. If you can go to the next slide. What's a patron? Patron was simply a sponsor. Okay, it's like a sponsor, a protector, or a father of a household. Okay, now this sponsor and the client has a mutual commitment, and which is sponsor has to protect the client, and the client has to provide services. So it's like a half slave, but more of a watered down slavery kind of system. Okay? Now what happens is this. This is kind of worse, okay? If you're a client and about 90% of people in the population of Rome were clients, and top 10 to 2% were patrons. Now what happens to clients, and probably most of us are clients if we were back in Rome, and what we have to do back then would be every morning we wake up and we would have to go to the patron's house, and there will be all of us lining up in the door, in front of the door, so that we can greet our patron in the morning. Right? So let's say like 8 o'clock when the patron wakes up, patron would come out to the door, and he would be saying hi to each of us, and we would be greeting him like, oh, hello, saba saba, all of that. And each of us patron will ask us, what do we need? What do you need? And we'll be saying food. And he would bring like a basket of food, like daily food. We'll be saying, oh, we need some legal advice. We need somebody to get me out of this trouble. And he would get a lawyer or something to get us out of court. We need this, we need that. The patron will look after whatever we need. And then what happens is, if we're lucky, we go home and we take care of our own business. But if we're not lucky, we have to do whatever the patron asks for. If you're an artist, you might have to paint for him. If you're a doctor like Luke, you might be looking after your patron. But then if you're if your patron had a feast, like a party, an important feast, you just need to go with him so that the patron looks good with a bunch of slaves and clients, okay? So you know what this is about. So clients weren't slaves, but they were more like, followers under the rule of your patron in the service. And Luke was a client. Who's on upper hand? Theophilus. Now what I want to show you is this. The one who is in power was not Luke. The one who is in power was Theophilus, the patron. The one who was in possession was Theophilus. The one who was way high up in the rank was Theophilus. But then who needed Luke? It was Theophilus. Yes, Luke probably needed his patron to take care of him in the world, but in God's perspective, it was Theophilus who was in need of Luke and his writings and his help. Luke had nothing. He was a client. Luke was not as successful, but he was having influences on somebody who's way more successful. The one who is making visitings every morning is helping out the person who is the owner of the house. Okay? Now this is influence. The Bible shows us that you don't have to have power or possession or a position to be influential. You can be influential in a reverse way. Even if you don't have power, position, or possessions, you can be the person that the successful person need. Why? Because you know Jesus. In spiritual perspective, this is what we need to know. This is what we need to be really certain about. If you know the truth, you need to know that truth is what makes you influential. Now, I want to give you two things that makes us to be influential Christians. And the first thing is that you need to have fear for the soul. Influences come from fear for soul. What does that mean? I think, and I'm probably 90% right. A lot of times when we hesitate to preach to somebody about Jesus, we hesitated because of this fear of rejection. What if I am ignored by this person? What if I'm not rich enough? What if I'm not high in the rank enough to affect that person? What if that person ignores me because I'm not important enough in this world? Now, this fear has to be overcome. And this fear can be overcome by the fear of losing a soul. About 3 years ago, I think, 3-4 years ago, I went to Yanji, the city of Yanji in China, where the descendants of Korea is living. And I took about 10 high school students and 2 uni students with me on a trip. And we went to serve an orphanage there. And we take a day to tour around, important places in the city. And at lunchtime, we went into this huge restaurant that was famous for the cold noodles, the North Korean cold noodles, right? And now the thing is, it was like fully packed. It was like fully famous for tourists, for locals as well. And we had to make reservations. And now reservations in Yanji is not same as in Sydney. You make reservations, but if other people comes in, they take it, okay? Now, we made 10 people reservation. We went in. These random local people just took our seats, and the staff couldn't even say a thing. You know, when I was young, when my parents made any complaints to restaurants and get all the attentions, I would hate it. I would rather just leave the restaurants. Now, I was a leader of 10 high school students, and I was in charge, and I was scared in that city, but then what I scared more is the safety and the starvation of our students. And so this fear for my students were bigger than the fear of any attention. I started yelling at them. I started fighting over the table we lost. I was speaking English to them, and they were speaking to me in Chinese. We were yelling at each other, the same thing. I don't know if they were saying the same. I was yelling, "This is our table," for like 5 minutes. I was like fully yelling, and 5 minutes, I won. They left. We sat. You know, this is the first time ever I didn't care about attentions. I didn't care about how I looked. I didn't care about any manners. Why? Because I care about my students. I care about their safety and their security. Now, it's about what you fear more. When it comes to evangelism, when it comes to be influential in the spiritual way, what makes you to be able to preach the gospel and have influence on people in a spiritual way is whether you fear about the soul's loss. Whether you care about the loss of soul or you care about the rejection. Now, I need to tell you that rejection and embarrassment is temporary, but the loss of soul would be eternal. Which is more valuable? Luke was a client. And as a client, if he crossed the line to the patrons area, then he would be, kicked out of the patronage relationship. But then Luke cared about the soul of Theophilus. And so he didn't care about anything. And so he just focused on writing about Jesus so that Theophilus can have certainty in faith and he's saved. Brothers and sisters, you need to know this. If you know Jesus, the world needs you. Probably you need that job, and that's why you're working under that boss. But you need to know that in spiritual perspective, that workplaces need you because you're the one who knows the truth of Jesus, the truth for the answers that the world cannot answer. Jesus sent us to make disciples because the world is in need. Wherever they are in the social ranks, they need Jesus. And especially, I think, especially people who are successful in this world, they are deluded to think that they are not in need. And that's why a lot of times those successful people are more vulnerable when it comes to spiritual matters. They're more isolated. And so, church, we need to be sent both to people in higher or lower rank. We need to go out to every single people, no matter what they have, no matter what kind of position they have, because we are sent to be influential and to preach the gospel that we know. Now, the second condition is something we need to work on really hard. And this is to show people what they cannot see. Influences come from showing what they can't see. Now, why don't we just have a look at verse 3. Verse 3 says, Luke followed all things closely. So what happened as he was writing his gospel was this. In verse 1 it says that many have undertaken to compile a narrative of Jesus. Now what was happening is, when church leaders were dying out, a lot of church leaders and other disciples wanted to write and leave behind some kind of writings about Jesus. And because by the time Luke was about to write an account of Jesus, there were already other writings about Jesus. Now, what Luke did was to gather all of them, and he critically read them and compared them to see if this makes sense. Luke didn't just write anything. He didn't just write this, but he was critically writing it. Why? Because this book is about to be sent to Theophilus, who's not really Christian, who's not really certain in his faith. And what I'm trying to say is this. Whenever we try to preach the gospel and show people about the spiritual matter, we need to be able to see things in their perspective. And that means we are spiritually open. Our eyes are open. We are seeing things. We're seeing the spiritual matters. We understand things that is from the Bible, but then people in the world are not. They're spiritually blind. And you can't really force spiritual blinds to see. Does it make sense? We need to see Jesus intensely. We need to see Jesus in detail so that we can really explain about Jesus and the gospel and the spiritual matters to people who can't see. And so you need to know as much detail so you can make the blinds to feel as if they're seeing it. Okay? You need to know how it feels to be in the spiritual world. You need to know how it smells like. You need to know how it tastes like, how heaven tastes, how heaven smells, how Jesus looks, how the Bible, what the teachings of the Bible feels, what it feels like to be in the presence of God, what it feels and what it looks like to be in the journey as Christians. And so when people are blind spiritually, we need to explain to them in all the senses we can so that they can actually see it. And finally, their eyes will be opened. This is really important for us to be influential Christians. Church, the world might tell us that success, power, position, and possession are things what make us influential. But we see that it is not. We see that it is those people who were not as successful, who are probably just ordinary or even lower than ordinary, or just any kinds of people just became influential when they knew Jesus, and then when they could see Jesus in detail so that they can explain things to the blind spiritually. So why don't we step up as influential Christians? Why don't we realize that we are the sent and to have influences in the world? And especially to the people who are successful, who are deluded to think that they're not in need. You know, we need to fear for the loss of their souls. We need to be fearing for the loss of the souls greater than our rejections and our embarrassment. And let us activate our influences. Let us activate it as we study the word in detail, as we try to see this in the perspective of the non-believers so that we can explain this in the language of the world. Okay? You know, if we just keep speaking the church language, if we just keep speaking the Bible language, I mean, Bible language is perfectly worldly language because Jesus spoke the worldly languages. And that's why people can understand Jesus so well. Now, Christians, my job is to teach you. And so I don't have to equip this, okay? My job is to train Christians, you believers. But your job is to reach out to the worldly people who don't know the church languages. And so it's your job. I can't do this job for you. You need to take this message and make this in a way that the worldly people can understand so that you can